Hi and welcome to RCKicks. On today's show, well, we're going to be building up a beautiful bit of kit. That's this from PR Racing. It's the PRSB401Type R. Now, I've done a previous video on this where we unboxed it, took a look at all those beautiful parts, but in this episode, we're going to build up the chassis and get it to a roller. Then in a future video, we'll get all the electronics in it, build up the body, and then take it racing, and then see how we get on, as this is going to be my four-wheel drive Noob Goes Racing modern buggy for the whole of 2024. So, if that interests you, stay tuned. Right, let's crack on and get this one built. Now the first thing we need to do is attach the two spines. This is a carbon plate fitted to a plastic section that bolts in through the bottom. Now this is a 2.5mm alloy chassis with plastic side plates. Obviously throughout this I will be using Loctite. You don't always see me using it, but I did on everything. This is going to be a well-used racing buggy, so you've got to be really careful to make sure you lock everything down, as it will rattle loose, guaranteed, and usually in the final. Now, one thing you've got to be a little bit careful with this kit is there's lots of bolts, all different sizes, some of them very close to each other, so make sure you double check every bolt to confirm that you're using the correct one. Now, it looks like this kit only really accepts full-size shorty lipos. You can see those two standoffs coming off of the plastic part. Well, that's where the actual battery top mounts are. So if you wanted to fit a low center of gravity lipo, do you trim them down? I honestly don't know. Luckily, I have normal lipos so I can use them, but you would think in this kit it would have the option to run low center of gravity. I will look at modifying it later on, but for now I'll just stick with it as it's supposed to be straight out the box. Now we move on to a 1.2 where we're fitting the front and rear mounts for the slipper clutch. As I'm going to be running this car on carpet, I'm going to fit the slipper clutch set. Included in this kit is a central differential set, so if you're going to take it on the dirt, obviously you're going to be looking at fitting that instead. While editing this video, I realised the PR Racing flame logo would look really good across the bottom of the chassis, so I'll see if I can get that made. Right, now we turn our attentions to A2, where we're basically building up the diffs. Now there's nothing super complicated about these, they're very standard diffs. Obviously these are oil-filled diffs. Now in the instruction manual it says for carpet you want to do 10,000 CST at the front and 7,000 CST at the rear. Luckily I had this in my parts bin, but according to the Pro Driver setup sheets, they use thicker oil. So I'll try and source the actual 1500 CST, I think it was, and then I will actually go back into the diffs and change out the oil. Now in this kit you get extra shims to go on the planetary gears. This makes it a little bit more fiddly when you're trying to put it into the housing. As you can see here, I kind of messed it up, but I didn't want to dig it all out, so I just fiddled around for a while until I managed to get it to drop into the housing properly. But I did it in the end and it's all nice and smooth. A massive thank you to Model Tune for sponsoring this content. Now, if you're interested in any of your own PR Racing good stuff or this lovely Corsatec electronics and pretty much anything else you want, I've got a coupon code that you can use that will save you 5%. At checkout, just use RCKicks and you could save yourself a few pennies. Anyway, I think that pretty much covers it, so let's get back to this build. One thing that really impressed me was the quality of the machining on these spiral gears. They are absolutely stunning. Now obviously don't forget to put the gasket in. I did struggle a little bit with the clips. They are quite strong, so it takes a lot of effort to get them in. You also have to push down to actually expose the insert on the actual shaft, but I got them in the end. Now, if I'm honest with you, it's blind luck that I just happen to have the correct CST oil in my oil bag. Now, this is one to remember if you're going to be building this kit, that you need to order the correct oil first, as digging out the diffs from this kit is not the easiest thing to do. And obviously you don't want to have to stop, jump in the car and drive down to your local RC shop. Don't forget when you've added the oil to really rotate the gears, as you'll be surprised how much air is actually trapped inside under the planetary gears. Now I'm going to try using some green slime. Now when I built my B6.4 I had loads of trouble with the oil diff leaking, so a few people recommended to give this a go. The idea is that this actually gums up around the actual joint and you don't get oil leaking. You can also use them in the shocks as well, so hopefully I used quite a bit. This is going to stop the oil diffs leaking, because one of the big issues is when they start leaking you don't know about them when you're taking it racing, and obviously it changes the way the car feels as the oil seeps out. One thing that I need to look into a bit more is when you're running a two-wheel drive car, if you take out two of the planetary gears in the rear diff, it means the car will actually rotate better in tighter corners. And that's what I actually did on my B6.4. I don't know whether doing the same works in a four-wheel drive car. If you know, comment below, let me know. Should I be running two planetary gears in the rear and four in the front when you're driving a four-wheel drive on a tight carpet track? Now in the kit you get 4 choices of spur gear, so that will give you all the options you need. Now it doesn't hurt to lay out everything before you build it, so you actually match what's going on in the manual. While you're laying it all out, that's when you kind of really understand the sequence and to make sure you've got every part and you haven't missed it. Now I do it because it makes life much easier when I'm trying to film, as I'm not sort of hunting for random parts, but when I'm not, I actually still do the same, as it just makes your life a little bit easier. Now in the manual there is a list of optional slipper pads, but you don't get them in the kit, you just get a standard carpet one. I was kind of surprised, being how many extra options were in this kit, that they didn't include those. Now there is one aspect that's highlighted in the manual, but you definitely want to check. When you're actually fitting the mount after the compression spring, there's actually a 3x3mm set screw. You've got to make sure that that set screw is tightened down on the flat part of the shaft, not on the actual thread. Don't forget the 3x5 by 0.03mm shim that goes in the outdrive. I did struggle to get the outdrive on, it is a tight fit. Now I've set my slipper to as per the manual of 1.1 to 1.3mm, but obviously when I take it to the track I might have to adjust this. And there you go, that's the front, the rear and the slipper all done. Now we can turn our attentions to getting them in the car, but don't forget to add the shims before you do. If I could just ask you to take 2 seconds, if you've watched the videos and you've watched a few and you enjoy it, to hit that subscribe button. 58.6% of you that watch the channel aren't even subscribed. It costs you absolutely nothing, and being that we're such a small RC channel, every new subscriber really helps the algorithm find our content and push it out to more RC fans like you. If you do find you're struggling to get the diffs into the diff housing, it's definitely the bearings. You have to push them really hard until they clip into place to give you the space to slide them into the mounts. So there you go, that's the diffs now mounted in the diff housing. Now we've got to turn our attentions to the prop shafts. We've got to do the front and the rear, but first we've got to fit the collars. A little bit of Loctite obviously, as we don't want this coming loose when we're racing. Now to help line up and fit the pin to the prop shaft, I put a load of moly grease over the end of it. That way it holds everything nice and still while you're trying to slide in the pin. Now in this kit, to stop the pin from falling out of the prop shaft, you actually have a spring that you feed over and it covers up the actual pin itself so it can't fall out. That's a little bit of a faff. I found that if you stretched over one end of it, put your fingernail in it and then rotated the prop shaft, it would slowly screw that spring into place instead of trying to pull it all on in one go. Now we can fit the carbon towers. Off camera, I've super glued up all the edges of the carbon because I don't want them to split, because I'm taking this racing. I also glued the table, my fingers, the part to the desk. Yep, super glue glues everything you don't want, but not the things you want. Putting the diff into the rear housing is just the same as what you did on the front. Now it feels like we've been spannering away for quite a while and we haven't really made any real progress, but now we've got the front diff in the housing and the rear and the centre slipper done. We'll drop these into the chassis soon and it'll all start to come together. Now that's done, we can fit the rear tower, and that's a thick piece of carbon. Now quite a few people that have these have commented to me that this thing is built like a tank, and going on the thickness of this carbon, you can kind of understand why. So far I've had no issues with fit and finish, and the hardware that comes with this kit is fine as well. And there you go, our hard work has started to pay off, and we now have a front and rear all done. So let's get these in the chassis. In the bottom of the diff housing and the chassis itself is location pins, so they drop in perfectly. I like the idea of the location pins, as once you add the bolts and it pulls it all together, it gives you a much stronger connection between the chassis and the diff housing. Now this one is a little bit lost on me, it's the peels, and I had the same issue with my B6.4, was to know exactly what's the correct choice. So I tend to just stick to what the Pro setup is, but I know at the front you want it to be pretty much neutral, which is F5 in this kit. Now I like my car to be quite sensitive and very lively, so I'm going to fit the optional sensitive alloy parts to each corner. But if I find that the front or the rear is way too sensitive and unbalancing the car, I will swap them out to see if that improves things. And that's the B2.2 front hub carriers all assembled. Now we move on to B3. Now according to the manual, these are the medium hardness arms. Now apparently there is optional extra ones which are graphite and they are high hardness. They are 775/00076s. Now the kit only comes with 2 anti-roll bars and they're both the blacks. Now looking at the Pro setup sheet, a lot of them use the black on the rear but not the front, so maybe this is something I'm going to change down the line. Now we get to the bit that I enjoy the most when it comes to building RCs, turnbuckles. Yep, I absolutely love making any turnbuckles. They just make my day. What part of building do you hate the most? Is it just the painting, the cutting out, the decals, building up the shocks? What is it? Comment below, let me know. One thing I can report about this kit, there is no way on earth you're going to pop a ball joint. They're so strong. I was amazed. Out of every kit I've ever built, I don't think I've found ball joints as tough as these. Right, there's no binding, so this is just what I'm looking for. Now we can move on to fitting the uprights. Now I'm not shimming the car anything over what the kit says at this point. What I'll do is I'll wait to the end, and once it's built, look to see where the slop is and then go back in and shim it up to see if I can improve it. But the fit and finish is really good, as you would kind of expect for a car like this, and I'm really enjoying it. Well, until I do the turnbuckles, obviously. Ugh. Now to save my fingers and to make life a lot easier when you're trying to set it up once it's built, I add a little bit of lube on the actual turnbuckles. That way when you're going to adjust them, they don't pop off the ball joints. Not that I think you'd ever be able to pop a ball joint on this kit, but just to make your life a lot easier, that it's not super tough when you're trying to adjust the car. So the build is moving along quite nicely and it's starting to come together. We've just got to do the same on the rear and then we've got ourselves a car. No binding, really chuffed. Hate having to go back in to sort out any binding issues. As for the rear peels, well, rightly or wrongly, I went for R9, which is basically in the center towards the bottom. That gives me a 1.6 plus toe and a 0 squat. One thing that I didn't add that I'm thinking maybe I should have is the plastic anti-squat shim. That's 1mm and 1 degrees. Now on the actual Pro setups, they actually had it on the RF and I didn't fit it. So maybe I'll go back later on and add it. Now we can fit the rear diff housing to the chassis just like we did the front. Well, that's what I thought. Turned out, could have been wrong. Hold on, just before you put those 4 screws in, Wait, there's a part you forgot that if you put the screws in, you'll have to take them all out. It's a collar that supports the rear diff housing. Now on the front, you can fit it afterwards, but on the rear, it's really tricky. So you're supposed to, and it is in the manual, clip it on and then fit the whole diff housing to the chassis. I'll put a picture up here of what it looks like so that you don't make the same mistake I did. Yep, sometimes you've got to go backwards to go forwards, right? Well, she's starting to look the part. Next, we have to turn our attentions to doing the rear arms and the drive shafts. All pretty standard stuff and not that different to doing the front, so we can just get this done and dusted, and then we can start looking at putting the electronics in it and finally getting to the end of the chassis build. Like I said previously, I'm going to put the aluminium rear hubs on the back as well. Apparently this is supposed to make things a little bit more lively. Also, there's two bottom mount sections that you can actually bolt to for the arms. I'm going to the higher ones. The idea is that lowers the C of G and brings the chassis down. So being that I'm running on carpet, that's what I'm going with. You need to add a 1mm shim to the rear shocks, apparently. As you can see, there's quite a few shims, so make sure you pay attention. You don't want to miss any of these out and have to come back later on. Now we get a few options of how we want to set up the rear hanger inserts. Now there's three ways you can do it according to the manual. There's for very high traction, medium traction and very low traction. Now I run on carpet, so I was leaning towards doing the very high traction, but for now I'll set it up to be on the medium, which is 2.5mm at the front and 2.5mm at the back. Basically you're setting up the upright to be right in the middle of the arm. Maybe later on I'll move it to the very high traction configuration, and that's both 2.5mm at the front, giving you a 5mm spacer at the front and nothing at the rear. This will shorten the wheelbase of the car by 2.5mm. That's all looking good, so now we move on to C4, which is the rear upper rods. So we've got to do the turnbuckles for the rear. Also, we've got to fit the ball studs to the upright. Don't worry, my friendly keyboard warriors, that's the only music you're going to hear in this whole video. Now it's time to fit the rear spoiler wing mounts. Now there's two options you can do with this one. You can actually fit inserts to push the wing further away from the chassis, and you'll need to use a 3x12mm screws if you're going to use these spacers. Right, so now we can move on to bag D, which is page 18 in the manual, where we're going to fit the steering. Now there is a lot of little shims in the steering, so take your time with this one. It would be very easy to miss one of the shims and then your steering is going to be a bit sloppy, or it's going to be binding up. Now there is some upgrade options for these. You can get some aluminium ones, which I probably will do, but when I built the steering it all felt quite solid. There wasn't a lot of play in it, so I was really happy with it. So just building the vintage YZ870C from Yokomo, it's like night and day. The steering on that is a real sloppy mess. This, on the other hand, is a completely different animal altogether. But then you can kind of understand one's vintage and one's modern. Now I did think that these shims were a bit large for this, but apparently that's what's in the manual, so that's what I fitted. And then you fit this little extra carbon bridge just to make sure there's no flex between the two towers. Now I don't know if you concur, but personally I think it looks really spiffy. I love the checkered carbon, it all looks really premium. Now we just got to connect up the tie rods, and I've dropped the slipper clutch into the actual housing. That's just sitting there, it's really easy, you don't have to bolt it in or anything. Then we've just got a carbon top plate to put over to hold the slipper in place. One thing I really like is the motor mount. It's a slide in and then lock down, so you can basically set any pinion you like. Super easy, you don't have to keep messing around, you just fit the pinion, then slide the motor towards the spur until you get the right mesh, lock it up and it's done. Right, I've just fired up the electronics as I want to make sure that the servo is sitting in the central position, as once I fit the servo horn and then put it into the car, I won't be able to adjust it without taking out the servo again. There's no access to the front. One thing that was funny to see is that the servo mount in this car is pretty much exactly the same as the servo mount in the Super Dogfighter that I've just built. Apart from in the Super Dogfighter, it doesn't have a mount at the other end where this one does. Now before you all go commenting, and I did mention this before, yes, I have put Loctite on all these bolts. Just because you don't see it doesn't mean it doesn't get done. This is something I haven't had in a buggy before. Apparently these are chassis stiffeners to improve the corner speed. So you do them up and it locks down the chassis. There's one at the front and one at the rear. Apparently going on my Pro driver setup, they actually have the front one locked and the rear one open. So it's like a floating joint. So I guess we'll have to play around with them at the track and see if it makes any difference. So that's pretty much the chassis done, so that leaves one thing to tick off, and that's the shocks. Now one thing I always do now is to grease up the actual threads on the outside. That way when it comes to adjusting the spring rates, it's just so much easier as you don't have as much friction. Don't forget to put in the little rubber grommet or they'll all rattle loose when you've done a few laps. How do I know? Well, yes, of course I've done that. Yes, I know I'm using a pair of pliers. Don't freak out. I'm supposed to be getting some tools, but who knows where they've gone. So I'm using some green slime on these, and I'm going a little bit over the top, I know, but once you start pushing the piston through, it clears them out. I don't want these to leak. In the manual, it actually gives you the option to put an extra gasket inside them, so it's supposed to stop them leaking. So they say, but it can actually make them more notchy. So I fitted them for now, and to be honest with you, once I'd finished building this, they felt fine. So if you're going to do this, I would probably add those, and you can always remove them if you have issues later on. So the oil I went with was what I basically had, was 650 CST in the front and 600 in the rear. As these are aeration shocks, building them up is super easy, no issues having to try and get rid of all that trapped air. So that's the hard bit done, and they all feel great. Now we got to do is fit the springs and the little hoops at the bottom, whatever you call those, and then slap them on the car, and then it's just the electronics and we're pretty much done. So mounting them on the car is very straightforward, just like you have done a million times on all your others. Now I'm going to set these to be quite wide at the front and the rear, obviously because I'm going to be on carpet. But we'll make some changes when we're at the track. I will have to pick up some shock hoods to protect the carpet, but you can pick them up off eBay and they're dirt cheap. So that's the front shocks all done. Yes, I know putting the rims on is a bit premature, but it makes it feel like it's more finished, so, well, you just have to excuse me. One thing that was a surprise is the actual wheel nuts on the front are a different size from the rear. The rear ones are larger. So there we go, all finished in its basic setup. Now we've just got to fit the electronics. I'm really looking forward to trying out this Corsatec ESC and motor just to see how it performs against my hobby wing. I hope I don't like it more, otherwise I can see some expensive bills coming in my future. So there you go, after many hours the chassis is built. I've put the electronics in just to get the layout right. I've still got to get my soldering iron out, but we'll do that in a future video and get everything soldered up, as well as I've got to attach the battery connectors as well. But the servo's in and the servo's trued up. I've just got to solder up a few bits and stick a few bits and pieces down like the ESC, and then I've got to solder on the caps as well, and then we can fire it up and bring it to life. I've got to order some tyres, obviously. Now, I downloaded a calibration sheet from a pro driver on a small carpet track, and I built the car to that as close as I could. There is a few things that I need to order, probably some different springs, because the springs that a couple of their pro drivers are using are different to the blacks that I've got on the back. The blacks on the rear seem to be consistent with the pro drivers, so I only need to get the front set really, but that's kind of understandable. As well as I need to buy some more diff oil. The diff oil that I had luckily matched the manual. So I will pick up different diff oil. It's a little bit thicker that they seem to be running as the pro drivers on carpet, so I'll source some of that as well. But that will come after we've taken it and done a shakedown run with it. So in the next episode, the plan is to cut out the body, got to paint up the body, going to solder all the electronics in, going to fit them all. Then we'll get the tyres on and we'll take it for a run and see how we get on with it. I'm really looking forward to taking this one to the track. It was a massive contrast to the YZ870C that I did from Yokomo in the last couple of videos. That was obviously a very vintage four-wheel drive. This is a very different animal. There is so much that you can calibrate in this one and change and adjust. Also, this Type R kit came with some extra pieces, so I've fitted those. It's got all the alloy on the all four corners, which is really nice, as well as it had some extra bits and pieces inside the shocks. But overall, a lovely kit. But then it should be, this is basically a modern racing buggy. So it's built to do one thing and one thing really well and go really fast. But we're going to find out, I guess. Also, I'm really looking forward to running this ESC and motor combo just to see what it's like. So stay tuned. If you haven't already, please like and subscribe. In the next video, we'll be doing all of that. So don't miss out. See you in the next one. Bye-bye.